The air is filled with a sound like 1,000 angry hornets. A sudden, terrifying hiss that drowns out the screams of dying horses. High above the muddy slopes of Crécy, the sky turns black, not from clouds, but from a rain of steel-tipped arrows. You are a French count, a man of noble blood, encased in the finest plate armor money can buy. You have spent your life preparing for the glory of war. But as you look up, you realize your armor is no longer a fortress. It's a coffin. One arrow thuds into your shield. Another shears through your chainmail. Around you, the pride of the French aristocracy is being mowed down by men they wouldn't even look at in the streets. This isn't a duel of honor. It's a massacre. This was August 26, 1346. On this day, the myth of the invincible knight was shattered forever. The world's most powerful cavalry had marched toward a line of ragged English peasants, expecting an easy victory. Instead, they found a wall of wood and a weapon that changed history, the English longbow. In just a few hours, the foundations of the feudal world would be torn apart. Kings would be humbled, the blind would seek death in the mud, and the common man would seize the crown of war. This is the story of how the elite were humbled by the grit of the working class. This is the day chivalry died. This is the Battle of Crécy. To understand why the French nobility fell so hard at Crécy, you first have to understand the weapon that killed them. In the 14th century, the English longbow was the equivalent of a nuclear deterrent. But unlike the complex crossbows used by the rest of Europe, the longbow was deceptively simple, a single, 6-foot stave of yew wood, carved into a D shape and strung with a thick cord of hemp or silk. Yet, this simplicity was backed by a level of physical power that modern humans can barely comprehend. A standard longbow used in battle had a draw weight ranging from 100 to over 150 pounds. To pull that string back to your ear, you weren't just using your arm. You were engaging your entire back, shoulders, and core. Archaeological finds from the Mary Roe shipwreck have shown that lifelong archers actually developed skeletal deformities. Their left arms were thicker, and their spines were permanently curved from the sheer repetitive stress of the draw. These weren't just soldiers. They were biological machines built for one purpose: to deliver death from a distance. The secret to their lethality lay in the training. While a king could buy 1,000 crossbowmen and teach them to shoot in a week, a longbowman took a lifetime to create. This is why King Edward III issued a royal decree banning all other sports on Sundays. No football, no wrestling, no dice. Only archery. Every able-bodied man in England was legally required to practice. This created a pool of commoners who possessed a skill that no nobleman could buy, and no knight could master. When 1,000 of these men stood together, they didn't just fire at targets, they created a zone of total denial. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Multiply that by 5,000 archers, and you have nearly 1,000 arrows hitting the air every single second. But it wasn't just the quantity, it was the physics. The English utilised a specific type of projectile called the bodkin point. This was a short, square-sectioned iron arrowhead designed specifically to punch through the interlinked rings of chainmail. To a French knight who had spent a fortune on his armour and his horse, the idea that a barefoot peasant from a Welsh forest could pierce his chest from 200 yards. A way was more than a threat, it was an insult to the divine order of the world. At Crécy, the French were about to learn that their heavy iron plates were no longer a symbol of status, but a target for a weapon that didn't care about their family name. The revolution of the longbow had begun, and the age of the armoured god was coming to a bloody end. While the English were perfecting the science of the bow, the French monarchy was doubling down on the myth of the invincible knight. To King Philip VI and the French nobility, war was not a tactical problem to be solved. It was a grand stage for the display of chivalry. They didn't just believe they would win at Crécy, they believed it was their birthright. After all, they possessed the largest, most glittering army in all of Christendom. The French army was built on a rigid social pyramid. At the top were the great lords, dukes and counts, encased in suits of iron that cost as much as an entire village. To these men, the common soldier, the infantry, the crossbowman, the peasant was little more than a necessary nuisance, a servant to clear the way so the real warriors could clash in a glorious, ritualistic duel. They viewed the English army, with its high proportion of foot soldiers and archers, not with fear, but with absolute contempt. This arrogance created a fatal lack of discipline. Philip's army was less of a unified command, and more of a collection of massive egos. Every French noble wanted to be the first to charge, the first to strike a blow, and the first to claim a highborn prisoner for ransom. In their eyes, the English were already defeated. The only question was who would claim the most glory. This cult of the knight meant that any tactical advice suggesting caution or coordination was seen as cowardice. To bolster their ranks, the French had hired 6,000 elite Genoese crossbowmen, the most expensive mercenaries in Europe. But even these professionals were treated like dirt by the French knights. The Genoese were tired, their equipment was heavy, and they knew the terrain was unfavourable. But when they asked for a moment to rest and organise, the French lords mocked them. To the fleur-de-lis, the Genoese were merely tools, like hammers or saws, to be used and discarded. This toxic mixture of overconfidence and class-based hatred set the stage for one of history's greatest tactical blunders. The French had no plan other than charge and crush. They didn't scout the English positions properly, and they didn't wait for their full infantry to arrive. They marched toward the heights of Crécy in a chaotic, colourful mass, convinced that their shining armour would blind the sun itself. They forgot that the low-born English archers had been practicing for this moment every Sunday for their entire lives. The French weren't just marching into a battle. They were marching into a trap laid by their own pride. As the two armies faced each other on that fateful Saturday afternoon, the sky itself seemed to sense the coming slaughter. A sudden, violent summer thunderstorm rolled over the field of Crécy. Lightning cracked across the heavens, and a torrential downpour soaked the ground, turning the sloping terrain into a treacherous, slippery slide of mud. For the English archers, this was a minor inconvenience. They simply unstrung their bows and tucked the precious silk and hemp cords inside their woolen caps to keep them dry. But for the Genoese crossbowmen, the mercenaries Philip had paid a fortune to employ, the rain was a death sentence. The mechanical strings of their heavy crossbows, made of gut and sinew, absorbed the water like a sponge. As the fibres swelled and softened, the weapons lost their tension. The most elite long-range force in the French army was suddenly rendered useless. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, King Philip, impatient and boiling with rage at the sight of the English lines, ordered the Genoese to attack. The mercenaries moved forward, exhausted and realising their weapons wouldn't reach the enemy. They gave 3 great shouts to intimidate the English, but the English stood as silent as statues. When the Genoese finally fired, their weakened bolts fell short, thudding harmlessly into the mud. Then, the English responded. In perfect unison, thousands of longbowmen stepped forward. The sun was now at their backs, blinding the French, and as they loosed their first volley, the sky vanished. This wasn't a trade of fire, it was an execution. The dry strings of the longbows snapped with terrifying power, sending a wall of steel into the Genoese ranks. The mercenaries, realizing they were being slaughtered without any hope of hitting back, began to retreat. This is where the crazy history turns into a nightmare. Seeing his expensive mercenaries retreating, the Count of Alencon, Philip's brother, didn't see a tactical withdrawal, he saw cowardice. He turned to the thousands of French knights waiting behind him and screamed, "Slay these rascals, for they shall let and hinder us without reason." On a direct order from their own lords, the French heavy cavalry spurred their massive warhorses forward. They didn't ride around the Genoese, they rode through them. The French knights began hacking down their own allies, trampling the very men they had hired to protect them. The field of Crécy became a chaotic meat grinder of blue and gold silk trampling over Italian crossbowmen, all while the English archers continued to pour thousands of arrows into the tangled, screaming mass of men and horses. The French had started the battle by murdering their own army, and the English hadn't even broken a sweat. The battlefield was now a hellscape of its own making. The French knights, having just trampled their own mercenaries, were now struggling to charge up a slippery, mud-slicked hill. In the 14th century, a knight on horseback was the medieval version of a tank. But even a tank is useless if it's mired in a swamp. As the French nobility spurred their mounts forward, shouting their ancient war cries, they encountered something no amount of training had prepared them for: a relentless, rhythmic rain of iron. This was the Iron Rain. The English archers were not firing at individual targets. They were firing in clouds. Each volley was timed to saturate a specific area of the field. Imagine the sound, not the clashing of swords, but the deafening, metallic drumbeat of thousands of bodkin-tipped arrows hammering against steel breastplates. To the knights, it must have sounded like a hailstorm on a tin roof, but a hailstorm that killed. While the knights were armoured, their horses were far more vulnerable. The English knew this. As the horses were struck by arrows, they didn't just fall, they panicked. Wounded animals bucked and reared, throwing their high-born riders into the thick, treacherous mud. Once a knight in heavy plate armour was unhorsed and stuck in the sludge, he became a turtle on its back, unable to stand. Unable to see through a narrow visor, and completely at the mercy of the next volley. The French, driven by a suicidal sense of honour, refused to stop. They launched 15 separate cavalry charges throughout the evening. Each wave of knights had to navigate over the growing piles of the dead and dying from the previous charge. The battlefield became a literal wall of meat. Dead horses and tangled bodies created a gruesome barricade that broke the momentum of every new French wave. forcing them to slow down and become even easier targets for the Welsh and English bowmen. Behind the lines of archers stood the English infantry, watching in grim silence. They didn't need to move. The longbow was doing the work of an entire army. The French aristocracy, men who believed their blood was sacred, were being systematically erased by anonymous arrows fired by men they considered subhuman. The field was no longer a place of chivalry. It was a factory of death, where the raw material was the French nobility and the product was a mountain of corpses sinking into the bloody mud of Crécy. If you're captivated by these forgotten chapters of history, don't let this be your last. Hit the like button to help spread the word and subscribe to join our ranks. If you're watching on your TV, just point your phone's camera at the QR code on the screen right now to join us instantly. History is written by the victors, but here we tell the stories that actually happened. Before we move into the final, bloodiest hour of the battle, comment below which medieval conflict you want to see us cover next. Your choice might be our next deep dive. Now, back to the slaughter. As night fell over the blood-soaked plateau, the Battle of Crécy moved from a tactical defeat into a legendary tragedy. Amidst chaos, the Peasants stood out King John of Bohemia. John was a legendary warrior, a man who had spent his life in the saddle, but by 1346, he was completely blind. When his scouts told him the French were being slaughtered, John didn't order a retreat. Instead, he made a request that sounds like a fever dream from a dark epic. I pray you, lead me so far forward that I may strike one blow with my sword. His knights didn't just lead him. They tied their horses' reins to his, linking themselves in a suicidal chain of loyalty. The group galloped into the iron rain. The next morning, they were found exactly as they had fought. Their bodies piled together, their horses still tied to one another in death. John had gotten his wish, but he had also provided a grim epitaph for the age he represented, an age that chose a glorious death over a practical reality. While the blind king found his end, a new legend was being forged in the English lines. The 16-year-old Edward, the Black Prince, was fighting for his life. At one point, he was beaten to his knees, nearly overwhelmed by a desperate French counterattack. When a messenger reached King Edward III, pleading for reinforcements to save the prince, the king's response was cold and calculated. He famously asked, "Is my son dead, or unhorsed, or so wounded that he cannot help himself?" When told the prince was alive, the king replied, "Let the boy win his spurs." I wish the day to be his. The king knew that if his son survived this meat grinder, he would be a king the people would fear and respect. If he died as a warrior. This was the brutal apprenticeship of the future Black Prince. As the French army finally shattered and fled into the darkness, the English didn't celebrate with songs. Instead, they moved through the field with a cold, industrial efficiency. Thousands of low-born Welsh and English infantrymen walked among the fallen nobility. They carried misericords, long, thin daggers designed to slip through the narrow eye-slits of an armoured visor. These peasants became the judges and executioners of the French aristocracy. They didn't care about ransoms or noble blood. They simply ended the lives of the men who had spent centuries pretending to be gods. The field of Crécy had become a mass grave for the idea of chivalry itself. The sun rose on August 27th over a world that had fundamentally changed. As the morning mist cleared, it revealed a landscape littered with the corpses of over 1,500 lords and knights and thousands more common soldiers. For the French, it was a national humiliation. For the English, it was a miracle. But for history, it was the funeral of an era. The Battle of Crécy proved a terrifying new truth. A cheap peasant with a piece of wood could destroy an expensive noble in a suit of steel. The social contract of the Middle Ages, where the nobility provided protection in exchange for labour, was exposed as a lie. If the knights could not protect themselves from a hail of common arrows, how could they claim a divine right to rule? This realization planted a seed of doubt that would eventually grow into the Great Peasant revolts and the slow collapse of the feudal system. Strategically, the victory at Crécy allowed England to capture the port of Calais, a foothold on French soil that they would hold for centuries. It turned the Black Prince into a figure of terror and Edward III into the most feared monarch in Europe. But the long-term legacy was even darker. The survivors of Crécy carried the trauma of this industrial-scale slaughter back to their homes. And just 1 year later, an even greater horror arrived on the shores of Europe. The Black Death. The weakened, war-torn continent was now primed for an apocalypse that would kill half the population. Today, we remember Crécy as a tactical masterpiece, but its true significance lies in the mud. It was the moment we stopped being a ritual of the elite and started becoming a brutal numbers game. The Iron Rain didn't just pierce armour, it pierced the heart of the medieval world. The age of the knight was over. The age of the common soldier, the long-range projectile, and total war had begun. The fleur-de-lis had wilted in the rain, and in its place, A new world was born, one where power wasn't determined by the blood in your veins, but by the steel in your hands and the grit in your soul. Chivalry was dead, buried in the dark, red mud of a French field, and the world would never be the same again.